Okay, when we're live, take it away, Edgar.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edgar Villanueva. I am the Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education. And we're delighted that you joined us this afternoon for another webinar as a part of our grassroots education series. So many of you know that I recently wrote a book called Decolonizing Wealth and Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and to Restore Balance. For over 2 decades, the Schott Foundation has been a bridge that has connected philanthropy with community to resource broad-based, community-led movements for education equity. We are actively trying to model our values around decolonizing wealth and centering racial equity in the work that we do at the Schott Foundation. We believe those that are most closely impacted by problems should be on the front lines of driving solutions to community change. In the book, I ask a question where I ask, what if we use wealth to heal and not harm? What if money was spent trying out concepts that challenge or shatter the structures and systems that have created inequity and disparity? This is a core argument in the book. And I use my own personal experiences as a Native American person working within philanthropy and as a foundation executive, along with a bunch of data and other conversations that I had with funders and social change makers. And I review the radical and colonial dynamics at play within this sector of philanthropy. But beyond philanthropy, we also take a look at banks, investment fund, and aid organizations and offer a path to healing. In the book, I write this. Ultimately, the call to philanthropy is clear. It must fundamentally change its ivory tower culture, what it accepts as acceptable behavior, how it defines success and leadership, in order to really walk its talk, to embody the love of humanity. Up until now, diversity and inclusion tactics have been about getting different kinds of people in the door and then asking them to assimilate to the dominant white culture. The issue is not recruitment of diverse humans. The pipeline focus of the past, getting people in the door, laying a seat at the table, as is often said. The issue is creating a culture of respect, curiosity, acceptance, and love. It's about building a whole new table. It is my honor today to welcome our guests to this webinar conversation. We are going to hear today from foundation leaders and philanthropic partners about how they are actually working to operationalize concepts from decolonizing wealth in their work day to day. Join me as we explore with these 3 leaders. They're based in Chicago, how they are striving to center race and gender and economic equity in their work. We'll hear a little bit more about their personal journeys, what they consider their role in philanthropy to be, and how they may have dealt with mistakes and criticisms along the way, and where they go for resources and support along their journeys. Our speakers today include Megan Bain, who is Senior Vice President at the Spencer Foundation, Bruce Boyd, who is Principal and Senior Managing Director at Arabella Advisors, and Angelique Power, President of the Field Foundation of Louisiana. Welcome to the program. Thank you guys for being here today. Before we jump into a conversation, I want to remind all of you, our participants, to please share your questions, your insights, and call to actions during our Q&A session at the end. Follow along with the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag GrassrootsEd or hashtag Decolonizing Wealth, and we'll stop our conversation to allow time for interaction to respond to questions that you submit all along the way. So by way of introduction to our guest, I would like to ask you each to introduce yourself and maybe just share a little bit about your personal journey around this issue of racial equity. Angelique, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. First, I want to say thank you, Edgar, for writing the book and giving us nationwide so much to think about and so much that we can use in our practice. And thank you for hosting what feels like a talk show today for us to share our stories. My name is Angelique Power. I'm the president of the Field Foundation of Illinois. And in terms of my personal origin story, what brings me to this work, although my family is from Louisiana, originally from New Orleans, I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. And my parents have both passed, but my mother was white and Jewish. My father was Black. She was a Chicago public school teacher. He was a Chicago police officer. And I feel like that background has given me sort of a lifelong experience in being a part of and apart from communities at the same time. I also feel like I was able to have sort of a passport into different cultures, to learn code switching from a young age, and to understand that ultimately we're more alike than we are different. Also, I would add that having parents who worked in these major systems, in the education system and in the criminal justice system, I grew up with the skepticism of, how often the people that are in the trenches, like teachers and police officers, are blamed for the exquisite design of inequity that they are left to try to clean up. And I think that's an interesting space for us to be in philanthropy, for us to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is our hand in the design of inequity? And where do we put the pressure on nonprofits to clean up a design that we have such a huge role in creating? So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Angelique. Bruce, I'll turn to you.
Thanks, Edgar. So I just wanted to first echo Angelique's thanks for the book. I think it's it's a searing and provocative critique, and one that was, I think, long overdue. So thank you, Edgar, for writing it and giving voice to the thoughts that many have had. As you said, I'm a principal at Arabella Advisors. We're a philanthropy and impact investing consulting firm. We actually have offices in New York, DC, Chicago, and San Francisco, and work with some of the country's leading philanthropists and impact investors. So for us, this issue around diversity, equity, and inclusion is important both internally to Arabella, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but also externally in our thinking about how we can reduce barriers to more equitable grant making and encourage our clients to sort of step out in the ways, Edgar, that you've encouraged us all to do. I mean, as you can see, I'm a super white guy, and unlike Angelique, I grew up on the other side of town. And so, I mean, I grew up in a privileged neighborhood and have been privileged. And what I have learned, and what has been a particularly moving and rich experience for me over the course of my professional career, is to better understand the inequities that are built into this system and do what I can to sort of address them, and to use my privilege as an ally. And I would say in particular over the last 5 years, as we at Arabella have been on a more intentional journey around diversity, equity, and inclusion, I have had some fantastic guides and mentors in helping me understand how to be a better ally. And I should say, Edgar, I've never made a single mistake in all of that time. I've been perfect. I wish that were true. Of course, I've made a bucket load of mistakes. And what I've had are people with whom I have built trust and who have been my guides along the way to help me be a better ally and sort of leverage the privilege that I have in advance of the principles, Edgar, that you've enunciated in the book. So I'll talk a little bit more about Arabella's journey and some of the things we're doing, but for now, I'll stop.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Megan, we'd love to hear a little bit more about you and what brings you to this work and what your personal experience has been.
Yeah, I also want to just start off with a thank you to Edgar. I'm very new to the field of philanthropy, and it's been a little dreamy to have Edgar write this book at the beginning of my experience in philanthropy to open up space for kind of Native voice in this. So I'm a mixed race Native woman who who identifies as an urban Native. My family and my extended family have all been part of relocation. And so I come to this work really as a newbie on lots of levels. And I guess I'll say a couple of things. I work at a foundation that is focused on educational research. So it's important to kind of know that's how I get here. And part of my life trajectory is that I'm a first gen person on many, many dimensions in my family. First gen to go to college, actually first gen to graduate from high school, first gen to go to college, first gen to end up in graduate school, and come to understanding how our systems are deeply entrenched in kind of racial inequalities and historically the role of colonization in that. So it's kind of been my thinking about that is partly what I come to, and I come from a family that continues. My partner and I are kind of the only college goers on both sides of our family. So we continue to have family that is navigating most of the deep issues of racial inequalities that I think about now all the time. And I just to say, we also are folks, so we are multiple generations living in urban spaces now. So I also think a lot around how urbanity and how the intersections of poverty and racial inequality and colonialism play out. And I grew up in a single mother household, and one of the things for me personally is I can pass, or I get read as racially ambiguous enough. Whereas I have siblings and cousins who aren't afforded that. And so for me personally, recognizing that part of the reason that I have a PhD and do this work now is because I was afforded a kind of light skin privilege that not everyone in my family has had. So I bring that to this work all the time and think about those things. But I also think a lot about how is it that we can transform. And one of the things I so appreciated about your book is not only can we think about how wealth has been accumulated through processes of colonization and racial inequality, education can be seen from a very similar lens. Education is and has been a kind of original colonial tool. And so the intersections for me is to think about how do we transform education in a way that can help communities thrive. And so Edgar, your book really helped resonate and helped me bring and think about, like, I have something to bring to this field of philanthropy because I know some of the deep structural things already.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate you sharing and being vulnerable in this space. I know over a webinar and with technology, sometimes that's a little hard to do. So a couple weeks back, I was in Chicago with these fine folks, and we had a breakfast and a conversation with the greater philanthropic community of Chicago, several leaders and trustees from foundations in the city. And I had a chance to talk with these three and many others about the work they were doing in Chicago. And I was really, really moved, one, at how authentic your journeys are in this work and holding the complexities of the space that we work in philanthropy, but also how you were, just how kind of openly you shared your challenges and some of the successes. I would love to revisit some of those things that you shared in that conversation. The conversation was so good to our audience that I wanted to bring this group back together because I think often we talk about equity and racial justice, and it's the theme of every conference. But when we get back to our offices and where the rubber meets the road, it's challenging to think about how to operationalize and institutionalize some of these things. So I would love to hear from you all about in your work, in your institutions and your organizations, what are some of the ways that you are actively applying concepts from the book? How are you decolonizing wealth in terms of your maybe in your giving, but also just in your internal culture, policies, practices, those types of things? And feel free to share challenges or maybe a time where you messed up or whatever you feel led to kind of share about with our participants who are really thinking through how to do this back in the office. Start with whoever feels like going first.
I'll jump in. So I'm going to weave my story in with some of the concepts that you go through, especially sort of the 7 steps that you lay out, of grieving and apologizing, listening, relating, representing, investing, and then finally repairing. And so I guess for us at the Field Foundation, I became the president almost 3 years ago, and I had been studying anti-racism. I'd been doing trainings and studying with other very smart people about these concepts, and I had grown to be a pretty big skeptic of philanthropy. I was at a different foundation. Not because of that foundation in particular, but more just the sector in general. It felt like we were very race agnostic. We did not like to, we liked to talk about need, and we liked to talk about how our work was aimed at communities of color, but we didn't actually have any sort of analysis on that. We never questioned why our boardrooms and our staff rooms were white people from privilege for the most part, designing solutions on behalf of communities. And we never questioned things like the metrics that then we attached to our theories of change and our solutions that felt very stringent, unrealistic, and punitive in many ways. And so I think that skepticism is actually what brought me to the Field Foundation, this desire to see if racial equity in philanthropy is even possible. What is that messy work? What does that look like when you try to do that? And the Field Foundation board and staff were really hungry for a new beginning, for change. And there were a lot of things happening in Chicago in 2016, as they are today, that drove a lot of us to sort of wonder if we could function differently and do better. So from the time that I've been at Field, we did a few things that I think helped us along our journey of racial equity. First, as we approached strategic planning, the concept of racial equity was in the center of that, not marginalized or after or a side project. And it was really important for me to have the full board, and I like bold, italics, underline, full board, and staff go through racial justice training. I think often that staff of foundations are woke and are often wondering how to bring their president along or their board members along. And that disconnect, I feel, is just, there's not much that you can do without the board, the spine of the organization, really understanding the work. We also created heat maps of Chicago, which are on our website, www.fieldfoundation.org. They're easy to download. We have them in PowerPoints. But the driving question of the heat map was really, how do race and need align in the city of Chicago? And, you know, not all white communities are affluent communities, and not all communities of color are poor communities. But in Chicago, there is a nexus of poverty and trauma and divestment that completely correlates to communities of color that have been designed, that have been redlined into existence by a tremendous amount of policies. And that helped us in our journey to realize that our work had to be about attacking the red line itself, rather than trying to deal with symptoms of an issue and then blaming nonprofits for not solving the systemic failure. So racial justice training led us to evidence-driven research around designed inequity, which led us to make some decisions. One, that we're going to be race explicit, that we're going to do continual trainings. Our staff go through anti-racism trainings constantly, so that we understand our own biases and muscle memory. We've added folks to our board. Our board is now 80% folks of color. Our staff is over 70%. Over 90% of the vendors we use are folks of color. I throw that out like cautiously though, because that feels more like diversity, like just checking boxes of having a lot of folks of color at the table, when it's really about equity is about sharing power and resources, which is different. But we're sort of in that space now. We've changed who we fund. The majority of our funds go into that designed community, which is the south and west sides of Chicago. The majority of our funds go to Alana, is a term we use, African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, Native American organizations. And we've changed how we evaluate our grants, which is really more about what we've done with our power and privilege, how much trust we've built, as opposed to asking nonprofits to create fiction to make us feel better. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. Bruce or Megan?
Megan, go ahead. Megan, do you want to go?
Sure. Well, I think I'll outline a couple of things. It's important for listeners to know that I came to the foundation in September, and before that, our new president had only been here for about a year. So I want to just kind of give a view of where I'm speaking from about this. And the first thing that I want to say is our new president did a year of field engagements, and we're speaking to thousands of people nationally to kind of think about what the directions of the foundation should be, listening to what people had as concerns. And part of what we learned from that is a series of things that I think has mattered to the kind of work that I've been up to. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that structural work internally. So Naila Nasir really led that effort to want to try to take some new directions of what was the foundation's relationship with folks that we funded. And so I mean both scholars, but I mean the education community more broadly. And part of what we heard is that it wasn't clear how we were making decisions. And we've really transformed kind of the way that we are thinking about making awards. And so I wanted to say a couple things about that. So one, we have transitioned, all of our grant making is now panel and peer reviewed, which means we look to the outside community who are grant seekers themselves to review and help us make all of our decisions. We also think about that as a way to build the capacity of the field. One of the things that we know is some people are really good at writing grants and other people have less experience. And so how that plays out is often a source of repeated inequity, and it tends to do things like privilege particular, better established institutions over others. And for us, it tends to be institutions that are known to be good research institutions and others that maybe are more teaching institutions. And so we really wanted to transform that. And one way that we've done that is to insist that all of our grants are peer reviewed and give us recommendations. But all of our grants also get feedback. So regardless if you're funded or not, everybody gets feedback. And it was really our way to institutionalize capacity building across the field. The other thing is for us to think pretty carefully about who we've been awarding to, where we've been making awards. So there's some things that Angelique had said, and how that connects to something that Edgar wrote about in his book. But there's a way in which racial inequality pushes who gets to make new knowledge and make new solutions. And the same is true in research and educational programming. In fact, lots of times I was a leader in a nonprofit previously, and oftentimes we had to talk about how we use evidence-based principles in lots of things. And the reality is that if we kind of follow who's creating the evidence, there are racial inequalities playing out there. So we also wanted to be really deliberate about saying, how are we taking responsibility to make sure that the production of new knowledge and the pursuit of new solutions actually reflects kind of the expertise across many communities. And so we've also attended to that. So we've thought about our internal processes, not only to make sure that we're peer reviewed, but there's a series of data infrastructure now that we think about so that these are these are around sort of holding diversity principles, but it's a way that we've constructed data infrastructure to hold ourselves accountable. So we think about, obviously, demographic diversity in both who is proposing to us, but also who's being served by grants. So there's lots of ways to think about that, but those are two different things that we hold on to. We also think about institutional diversity, so thinking about the range of institutions. We think about topics and methodological ways of approaching these things so that we're really clear that we're not reproducing kind of what we think or what has been historically held up as the right way to investigate things. I think the other couple of things that I just want to say about our internal processes, it sounds similar. We have done a series of racial equity trainings and thought about some of our internal kinds of culture and processes, as well as how we're going to keep working on these things. We kind of approach this as a always ongoing. There is no arrival about these things. It is always continual work, in part because I think we're learning how to be responsive to particular contexts, which means those are shifting as well. And so I think that's one thing to hold, is that we take an approach that we think about and are always reflecting on our processes and shifting them so that it's not we've perfected our infrastructure and now we've arrived. And that, I think, is an important and somewhat it can be a challenge to kind of be in a perpetual revision kind of place, but I think that that's important. And I think the last thing that I wanted to mention around our review processes and sort of internal structures is that we're also thinking about systematized ways that we're continually doing outreach to new potential grantees. We actually make sure we have a way of kind of identifying where have we been and who have we been inviting into the foundation in a way that we're starting to be much more systematic about. So we think about going to places and geographies that we don't get many proposals from. We're a national and international organization. Just to say about that, we fund internationally as well as nationally. But we also are looking at things like institutional diversity, where we're deliberately reaching out to places we've never heard from. We are also reaching out to kind of organizations that are ways to access scholars of color in particular, but other groups of scholars that are underrepresented and groups of practitioners that are underrepresented, to be deliberate about saying, you know, we want to hear from you. We want to have the opportunity to fund you and the kinds of work that you're up to. And so, you know, we're pretty early in that process. We started that through field engagements, and now we're figuring out how do we do that routinely so it's not a one-off or listening tour. I think that one of the things that we've sort of seen is that people do that, and then they often create strategic plans that are 5 to 10 years out or whatever it is, and then they listen again. And we're trying to make that listening practice and that continual input as part of our routine processes, and figuring out how to do that in efficient ways. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you.
So,
Bruce?
Yeah, so, I mean, really impressive work that Angelique and Monica and their teams have done. And, you know, I won't spend a lot of time on what we've done with clients. I mean, we have tried to work with clients in helping them be more inclusive grant makers, like the Field Foundation and the Spencer Foundation are. So we've done things like developed a tool for more inclusive grant making that was published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review several years ago. We've since updated that. But we've also done things like create funds that get money to frontline grassroots organizations. Those funds are led by frontline grassroots leaders, and it reduces the barriers that many of our clients talk to us about and make it much easier for them to get money to the front lines, to these smaller organizations, often led by people of color. That's some of what we're doing externally in the hopes of encouraging more grant makers to be like Field and Spencer. Internally, our journey has also been very interesting. So, you know, we're a 12-year-old organization. 5 years ago, we made a very intentional commitment to become more diverse, more inclusive, and more equitable as an organization. We felt that was important because we wanted to work in a place that was that way. We found it more rewarding, more interesting. And frankly, we felt we would be a better partner with our clients if we reflected the diversity of the communities that they and we were hoping to serve. So we did things like when we were recruiting, we hired a recruiting team of diverse recruiters. They had different networks. They had a different approach to recruiting. That was important. We slowed our hiring process, so we didn't make an offer until we had a diverse pool of candidates. And we did things like institute blind resume review. We removed names from resumes. We removed schools from resumes. We removed salary history. So all of these things as an effort to reduce implicit bias. So as a result of that, we went from a firm, we're now 225 people across the country. We were about 18% people of color 3 years ago. Today, we're almost 40% people of color. So those changes made a dramatic difference around diversity. To Angelique's point, in some ways, that's the easier challenge. Then we wanted to become a more equitable and inclusive organization. We have done trainings and workshops and webinars. We now have a people of color caucus. We've got leaders within the firm, diverse leaders who are pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're about to hire a chief diversity officer. So all of these things are meant to promote both more diversity, but importantly, I think some of the harder work around equity and inclusion. And we have had some challenging conversations, I have to say. So one of them was around the name of the company. So Arabella, that name, is actually associated with a guy named John Winthrop, who came to this country in 1630. He was a preacher and he was a sea captain. When he arrived here, he got up on the bow of his ship and he gave what became a very famous speech called the City on a Hill speech. And in that speech, he talked about a bunch of things, including abridging ourselves of our superfluities, which was a fancy way of saying, Edgar, if you had two coats and I didn't have one, you might give one to me. People point to that as a beginning of the philanthropic tradition in the United States. The name of his ship was the Arabella. So that's a lovely story if you just ended there. But the reality of Winthrop is that he was a Northern European displacing Native Americans, and more than that, or in addition to that, he was a slave owner. So all of a sudden we're embroiled in this very complicated conversation about the genesis of the name of the organization. And what we chose to do is to eliminate the Winthrop story from our website and our business cards, but to keep the Arabella name and to reflect on that as an example of the very complicated and tortured history of philanthropy in this country that, Edgar, you have written so eloquently about. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate it. We are already getting lots of questions from our audience. I want to remind everyone, if you would like to share a question with our speakers, please put that in the chat box or tweet us at #decolonizingwealth or #grassrootsed. I just want to highlight some of the nuggets that I heard from you guys. One, starting with you, Bruce, I think it's really important what Arabella did and taking a look back at its history and origin. And what I encourage folks, especially funders, but all of us, to do in the book is to hold up a mirror and look back into our history and to ask ourselves, what is the origin of this wealth? And who may have been harmed in the process of accumulating wealth? Often we don't know the full story. Even the foundations where we know they made their money from whatever industry, we know that along the way that institutions that we work in and are partners with, many of them did harm communities along the way. And we owe it to these communities to do a thorough review of our history and understand what ways we may have harmed communities so that we can move forward with that understanding and remembrance as we're designing strategies to then help those same very communities. I also heard the importance of training, not just for staff, but for the board members. Everyone from the top down in organizations need training, and this has to be something that is happening on an ongoing basis, right? Because we live and breathe and drink the water of white supremacy and white dominant culture every day. And so it's really important that we're constantly, this is what I mean by decolonizing, is actually shifting our thinking to not be centered around whiteness. We must be race explicit in our work and in our mission. If we are race neutral, then we are actually probably potentially causing harm. We will not achieve equity if we're not explicit about race in our internal work, but also in our grant making. I really appreciate you all touching on the difference between diversity and equity, right? We know diversity is about representation, and that's a good thing and it matters, but we have to go deeper as a sector. And in many ways, I think we've done a disservice sometimes by lumping DEI together, right? Because we know they mean very different things. And equity, as someone said, is about giving up power and ownership. I love that you all shared how you're creating transparency and how decisions are making, decision making is happening in your organization, and the efforts to extend beyond sort of the networks that we know and are familiar with to new organizations, new partners, and to make it easier for those groups that have been marginalized to actually access the resources. So there's a couple of takeaways that I've pulled out. I think we're going to transition now to some of the questions that we have coming in. And then I'll loop back around for you all to just say a few closing remarks before we go, if there's still something that you definitely want to get in. There is a question that has come in around the challenging work of selling this internally, right, to those board members who may not be on board, to those presidents of foundations who are agnostic to this work. How do we who are committed to racial equity, how do we get others within our institution who hold power to get on board with this work? What are your thoughts about that? Whoever feels like responding.
This is a big question. Bruce, did you want to take it?
I was going to suggest that you go first, actually.
Thank you. This is such a big question, and I get this all the time because I think that diversity spectrum, what happens is that a lot of foundations hire folks of color and they think that that's it, that they've done what they're supposed to do. And then they bring in these brilliant minds who want to do equity work and are running up against the resistance of structures that weren't made for them to have power in that way. I say, and I think that this is what helped at Field. When I first started at Field, I interviewed one-on-one with every board member. And what I realized really quickly is that everyone wanted change and everyone wanted impact. And I'm doing air quotes around those words for anyone who's calling in. But that those words meant different things to everybody. And I think we can assume positive intent, that everybody is in philanthropy because for the reasons that they believe are altruistic, for reasons that they believe are about social impact and helping. And maybe I'm naive, but that is what I believe. And so I actually recommend, before you just dive into racial equity work, which racial equity is this term du jour that everyone feels like they should be doing racial equity, but they have no idea what it actually means. I would probe with the powers that be, like all the power lines inside of philanthropy. I would probe to find out what is the motivation to get to the other side, to continue when things get rough, because they will, and to clearly understand what are the third rails that need to be disrupted. So I wouldn't just blindly go into conversations about race. I would also understand that we as a society don't know how to talk about race in mixed company. We just don't. We're so afraid of offending and we're so afraid of being offended that we avoid the conversation at all costs, or we say the things that we think we're supposed to. And because we approach it that way, we codify racism. Often folks of color inside of foundations feel like they have been appointed to the DEI committee, that they are supposed to come up with the strategy and implement it and solve racism. I would recommend getting trainers from the outside who are well-versed in all of the landmines and the traps in the conversation around race, because there are about 8 landmines or traps that always pop up. Have them come in, work with the board right away, and have the first thing be identifying what's going to keep you motivated when it gets hard, and identifying what are the things that you're not supposed to touch, because then you'll know what your work is supposed to be.
I want to just add two things. So I feel like Angelique just laid it out. I feel like there's two dimensions. So one, I should say, I'm probably not the best person to answer that, because I have a president who is working hard at this and a board that also wants to, although I think we're figuring out many of the dimensions that Angelique is talking about right now. There are two kinds of things that I feel like I've quickly come to recognize, is that having an explicit conversation about why people think there are persistent inequalities and persistent racial inequalities often surfaces assumptions in a different kind of way that I think has been helpful in having these conversations, because sometimes we're not practiced at it is in part because we have really different explanations about why we are where we are. So I would just, that's one thing that I think is helpful in these conversations. The other thing is that I've noticed that there is a kind of enclosure around pragmatics that sometimes forecloses conversations about the possible space that we might act in. That I think we've been working on saying, like, okay, so we can talk about what are levers that can be pulled now, or we can invest in right now, that we can imagine some impacts, and what's the longer run game, and sometimes opening up that we're allowed to talk about all of those things simultaneously has been an important kind of lesson in opening up these spaces, because the enclosure of pragmatics as a kind of policing of conversations about racial equity, I have personally experienced a lot happening in both within the philanthropy world, but I actually think it's a thing that is happening beyond the philanthropy world too, and it's connected to not being very good at kind of conversations about racial equity and racial inequality in mixed company kind of ways of saying that. So those are two things that I would just add on about ways to do this. But the explanation of inequalities and what's allowed to be identified there as actionable kinds of things we might take seriously, in my experience, often reveals that people think poverty is the root cause of racial inequality. And think that shifting economic systems is the solution. And I'm not suggesting it's not part of a solution, but it is really interesting. And I think that Edgar's book has really opened up, actually, that we have to have a much more nuanced explanation. And part of why poverty as the only explanation is probably insufficient for us to do the things that we need to do.
And Edgar, I would just add that, I think in driving change in organizations, often these organizations are white-led organizations. I mean, what we have found is sometimes compelling is if your intention, as Angelique said, is to help a community or to drive change, it seems odd not to engage the communities that you're seeking to help in the conversation and positioning them in a leadership way, because after all, they are the ones who know better than anyone else the challenges that they face and the solutions that might sort of lift them. So we find that in talking to people of privilege, a pretty compelling argument for engaging people of color as partners, as decision makers, sort of centrally in that conversation. And then the other thing I would say in white-led organizations is that you really need an ally and a champion. I mean, we see this happening all the time. If you don't have allies and leaders at the leadership level and champions at the leadership level, you are just not going to get where you need to get. So having allies, having champions is also, it seems to me, a really important part of this.
Thank you, Bruce. You set me up perfectly for the next question, because you have talked about allyship a little bit on this call. I would love to hear from folks who identify as people of color on the phone. How do you define a good white ally? What has been the behavior, the characteristics of a white ally that's been effective for you? And then what advice might we have for white folks who are well-meaning, but sometimes may stumble over privilege in a way that is not helpful or maybe even frustrating for us as people of color.
I'll jump in. I think this is like the essential question. And you and I, when we talked on the phone prior to this, I said this should be like your next book that you write, because I feel like we 100% need folks who identify as white in the space. We 100% need anyone that carries privilege in the space. Megan, you talked about light skin privilege, colorism, which I benefit from as well. Like, we all have a certain amount of privilege that we bring into these conversations, and we have to leverage it as a battering ram to move the conversation and the movement and the action and the policies forward. So, I think that there's been a lot of like language police around the term ally. Some people prefer accomplice. I like homie because, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, but I think that it's extremely important. I love when white people identify themselves as white people in the conversation. Like, that just, I feel like that's such a relief for everybody of color. The second a white person's like, look, I'm a white person. And we're like, phew, that. So I think that that's like step one. And then also doing the ongoing work of understanding your privilege and having the same meta existence that folks of color do, where we're constantly mitigating what our role needs to be when we step forward, when we step back, how we're perceived in the conversation, when it's our time to lift someone and when it's our time to fall behind. Like, that's just me, walking to the bus in the morning. So it's like, white people join that space and join transparent about the fact that you're now part of that mitigation. And I think you'll be welcomed.
That's awesome.
Edgar, I'm happy to write that next book with you, by the way.
All right. Absolutely. And then another question that I just want to touch on briefly. So often in this work, there's a chapter in the book that is about internalized oppression that was very painful for me to write. Because, often in the work of racial equity, racial justice, we focus primarily on, dismantling white supremacy, that is oppression that comes from whiteness, and maybe from white people. But I understand there to be a two-legged stool that holds up this system. There is that stool, but there's also internalized oppression that sometimes people of color or other marginalized folks can take on and replicate the bad behavior, the bad leadership of white dominant culture. And this is something that we don't talk about often because when it's painful, too, we don't have spaces, I think, for those types of safe conversations. But I'm just wondering, especially again, for people of color on the phone, if you have found ways in your own life to deal with internalized oppression, or another way to think about it might be to hold yourself accountable as a person who historically has not had power and now you have power. How do you grapple with all of that as a person of color? Or a woman, or however you want to identify.
Maybe I'll start and then Angelique. So I think I appreciate you raising this. I think that there's a lot of different ways that this plays out. One of the things that I was thinking about as Angelique was speaking also is how our privileges change over the course of our lives too. So they're not stagnant. And I mean that to say that I grew up in poverty, but now, like, I'm super wealthy compared to the rest of my family now, right? Like, I have opportunities that I couldn't have fathomed before. But it also means now that I end up in situations where I have to think carefully about how I have acquired new perspectives that can be a kind of internalized oppression, or that I might be acting from places that are quite different. And I'll also say this, that one of the things that I feel like I work really hard at is to always recognize when the haterade is coming up, right? Like, and the ways that tokenism plays out a lot of times, like how is it that we hold each other up? And I think that as we're making change in fields that have been historically led and dominated by white folks, there's a kind of process that emerges where there's a real tokenizing kind of culture that emerges. And there's a kind of ways that when communities have been working for and actually going after minimal resources, there's a kind of politic that opens up that we actually hurt each other in a critique because we have been having to go after small amounts of resources. And so I think that one of the things that I work pretty hard at is to think about, like, how do we, and how do I personally do this, but also how do I think about it in organizationally, rather than sort of critique or not like what is going on? What's my role in helping to expand capacity or to hold folks up in different sorts of ways? And so our review processes, that commitment to feedback was around how is it that if we see good ideas or we see something that's not quite in shape that we want just yet, how do we help support and raise up folks? So I've been trying to think about that in our review processes and in our internal processes. But I'll just say that internal, like for my own self as a professional, but also as just a human in this, I think trying to navigate those things means always sort of stepping back and acting from a place, which I feel like, Edgar, your entire book is an act of sort of trying to see forward in a loving kind of way that holds deeply the roots of things, but trying to act in a way that isn't a replication of kind of the isms and the troubles that we're trying to actually heal from. And so I try to think about that all the time. At the same time, I will also say this, that this is sort of personally where I'm at. I've also recognized how those things play out internally for us, as if, you know, my own personal journey of saying, like, oh, if I'm not living in poverty anymore, has that meant that I'm selling out in some way? And so there is interesting ways that I think that these internalized oppressions actually structure what we imagine as possible. And so I think the idea of decolonizing wealth and thinking about wealth as a healing is really a powerful invitation for us to collectively think beyond the kinds of ways that inequalities have structured the world for us. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Angelique, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I struggle and I work on it every single day.
Yeah.
Every single day. And white protectionism, trying to protect white people in the conversation. Like, you know, and the only thing I'll say is that I have a 9-year-old daughter, and, you know, you sort of parent yourself when you parent your kid. And I say to her every day, like, there's a pill that society wants you to take, and it tells you who they think is pretty and who they think is smart and who they think is, you know, X, Y, and Z. And you cannot take that pill. And she'll say to me, like, well, Mama, did you take the pill? And I'm like, every morning it goes in my mouth and I spit it out. It's an active, like, you know, rejection of what feels like what comes naturally, because we've all gotten the messages our whole life.
Absolutely. Well, as we're looking to close out here, I want to just invite you all to say if there's anything on your heart that you haven't had a chance to say. And if not, maybe you could respond to this question. I feel like we are in a very different moment right now in the space of philanthropy. It's a day of reckoning. It feels like a point of no return. We have ripped off a Band-Aid. I don't even know how else to describe it. How do we not go back? How do we make this more than a fad or a popular conversation or a conference theme to really continue to go deeper and forward as a field? Or whatever else you may feel inclined to say as we're wrapping up.
Well, maybe as the novice on this panel, I'll go first so that you can hear the wiser words right after me. But one thing that I don't think we've just said that I kind of wanted to acknowledge about both Edgar's book and the conversation and where I'm at in my own trajectory around understanding philanthropy is that other 95%. And I have been so moved to sort of think about what's collectively possible as the field of philanthropy takes deeply serious this work, not only in our grant making, but understanding what it means to think about wealth management differently and think about how it is that our economies could be different. And so I just wanted to say that I feel like that's another thing, Edgar, that your book raised. I don't know where to go with that. It feels like the exciting next universe for me professionally to try to understand and imagine what's possible. But we haven't quite raised that. And it was one of the most powerful things in sort of the time together we had for me that I have continued to kind of just, I don't know, you've sort of invited me to imagine possibilities there. And certainly the leadership on this call and other leadership has been thinking about that. But I wanted to raise what happens if we thought about the other 95% differently too.
And I'll go because I want to leave the last word to Angelique and to Edgar. So I guess, Edgar, I would just say that I suspect there are other white people on this call. You know, I am, as I said, a very white guy, and I'm also an old white guy. And what I would say is that for me, this journey has been hugely enriching. Of course, challenging at times, difficult at times, but also enormously powerful. So for those white folks who are listening on the phone, I would just say to you, this is an opportunity for all of us to grow, to learn, to enrich our lives and the lives of others. And it's so important because without good, strong, committed allies, I think it's hard for the community to succeed around these issues that we've been talking about today. So I just want to put in a word for more white allies and just to remind you that yes, it's challenging, yes, it can be hard, but it will be among the most enriching and powerful things that you'll do.
And I just want to share something from your book, Edgar. You wrote about all my relations, and you said, all my relations means that everyone is at home here. Everyone has a responsibility in making things right. Everyone has a role in the process of healing, regardless of whether they caused or received more harm. All our suffering is mutual. All our healing is mutual. All our thriving is mutual. And that gives me hope that it's not a phase or a fad, but it is a way forward.
Well said.
Beautiful. I could not have ended on a better note, Angelique. Thank you. I just want to thank you three again. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Angelique. Thank you, Bruce. And say to the field, y'all better watch out for Chicago. There's some great work happening there. We often think of the Bay Area, New York, right, when we're thinking about what's happening in philanthropy, but Chicago has it going on. It's hot. And I'm so inspired by your work, and I appreciate you making the time today. It's so important that we lift up what is working and the efforts that we all are putting forth to decolonize wealth. I want to invite our participants, if you're not following along with this conversation, please go to decolonizingwealth.com. You can subscribe there to learn more about the work, to watch videos, to read information, to order the book. Jump in. This is the conversation that is happening in philanthropy. If you're not talking about racial equity, your head is in the sand. This is the conversation that we all must be talking about. I also want to invite everyone to stay connected to the Schott Foundation, schottfoundation.org. Please join our National Opportunity to Learn network to hear about more events and like this, where we get together to push our thinking and to really try to come together to advance progress in this country on behalf of our young people, especially young people of color. So thank you, and we'll all talk soon. Appreciate you all taking the time again. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar.
Bye-bye.